Hello everyone, welcome to you all. Black Diamond Public School, Gadikatona, Jammu, Bihar. Today, in this in-house training session, we will be aware about communication skill. So, it is an essential part of our soft skills or interpersonal behavior. So, let's aware how it is so effective for every human being. First of all, a word communication. The origin of this word related to another word, this is communicare. That means sharing. So in this sense, communication is actually defined as a sharing of information between two or more individuals or within a group to reach a communication या common understanding. Actually, communication and its types and its element all are so convenient for every human being. But first of all, we have to aware what is soft skill. If I talk about the any individual's behaviors, manners or etiquettes, the all characters comes under this interpersonal behavior, which are generally known as soft skills. Soft skills totally related to our interpersonal behaviors as well as characters as manners and etiquettes. So among these soft skills, communication is a part. So for improving our this quality, we must aware about really what is communication and how we can deal with the communications and how it is so useful for every individuals, any expectations or any way of expressions among anyone. So let's first of all we go through the importance of communications. Actually, communication skills needed to following elements. First is inform means informations to someone. Next, influence, how we can make understand any others. So this comes under communication skills. And next, express feelings, how we have to and how we would like to express our feelings. All are comes under importance of communication. Actually, communication is the most important segment for every individual through which they can express their feelings, thoughts and ideas between or anyone's, between anyone's or among the animals, because our behaving, our expressions totally depends upon how we are how we are using the way of communication. So it is so important for expressing our feelings, expressions or our idea or thoughts. Now, main objective of effective communications and communication. The objective of communications are sending, receiving and understanding the message or information. Next, development of interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skill, that means every individual's, every human being's interpersonal behavior to express effectively and with maximum efficiency. Now let's see here types of communication. Types of communication, you can look here. It is categorized in two ways. First, based on communication channel, another is based on style and purpose. Under this section also are subsections like non-verbal, verbal, oral, written, and simultaneously based on style and purpose, formal, informal. And also are subcategorizations of oral communication related to face and distance. So these are the basic platform related to our communication. But if I talk about the main categories of communication, so this is including only verbal, non-verbal, written and visual. These are the basic categories which are generally used by any particular individuals, not or general individuals, for expressing their thoughts and idea. Now let's learn what is verbal communication. So basically verbal communication totally related to those kinds of communications which we are using, for our expressing our thought, idea, or our expressions. So these are comes under with the help of spoken words. So any spoken words we are using for expressing our feelings or expressions of thought or idea, all are comes under the verbal communications, and it is one of the most helpful communication system which also support non-verbal and written communication. For example, we are generally often used this for our video conferences, phone calls, meetings, and one-to-one conversation. Next, advantages of verbal communication. With the help of verbal communication, we can save our time because there is no need to any mediators, any facility to express our intentions or messages. So it saves our time. It also saves our money because there is no requirement of paper or designing flair. And the next, feedback quickness, and by the help of verbal communication we can get quick feedback. Next, it is most convenient method. In compared to others communications method, verbal communication is so convenient. And next, ease of preparations, and it is so easy to prepare at any time of instance. If I talk about the disadvantages, then there are several disadvantages which comes under it. Chances of distortions of meaning. That means कि most of time if we are expressing, we are speaking our thought and idea, but any kinds of barriers taken place, then in this sense our meanings will be meaningless. Next, not convenient for long messages, but it is here I can see if we would like to express our thought and idea in a long durations, then it is not convenient. Irrelevant information, most of time we are conversing or discussing with anyone, then most of time it is so unnecessary and wasting of time, because if we are processing our communications, if any unwanted discussions taken place, then in this way our spoken communication, that means ki verbal communication, totally become irrelevant. Create a misunderstanding, that means ki most of time if any listener haven't a tendency to understand your spoken words and are having a different meaning of your spoken words, then in this way it leads a misunderstanding. Most of time it leads a cost, communication coach, because most of time if we are as a talking to different regions people or tradition or cultural people, then in this way they are using different languages. Then in this way, if we would like to talk to them, then in these conditions we need interpreters, so we have to pay for that. Now next, non-verbal communication. Non-verbal communication is just opposite of verbal communication, because this is one of the communications, one of the kinds of communications where a spoken words is not used, but we can use only our sign language, that means indications. It may be body language, gesture, facial expressions, or any other symbolic indications. So whatever we would like to express to any others for their understanding, so we have to use these kinds of procedures and symbols. That means absenteeism of a spoken words leads a non-verbal communication. Now, for more elaborations of non-verbal communications, a most important thing takes place in this way, which is body language, because it is an aspect of this part where physical behavior is used, like facial expressions, posture, gesture, touch, use of a space, eye movement, and these groups are known as kinetics. That means non-verbal totally depends, not a totally, but has a more than depends upon the kinetics. That means the body language. You can see here different expressions of our and gesture and posture of our body. These symbols, these indications shows what people would like to express to the listeners or their audience. Please observe these pictures very carefully. Yeah, I hope you really understand what they would like to express. So this is one of the most important expressions or gesture of posture for non-verbal communication. Now, what we have to do or don't for non-verbal messages or body language. The first, do. Here, it is so important point we have to keep in our mind while we are using non-verbal communication. Either you are at any public places or any audience, but being a teacher, it is so important for conveying your messages to the students how you have to deal with the student without using a spoken words. So it is so important for those you all teachers how you have to behave in non-verbal messages in your behavior among the students. So then you can see here list of those whatever we have to do. The first is make a eye contact. It is so important for your conversations of masses while you are not using the spoken words. Next, have a palms handshakes, which comes under the non-verbal. Check your facial expression. Always as a face, always adjust your facial expression according to situations and be natural. Whatever gesturing and posturing you are maintaining, try to be always natural with your gesture. Maintain a receptive posture. That means which are the adjustable, acceptable. Please try to maintain those kinds of posture. Next, try to avoid mismatch messaging. Next, whatever action are taken, observe very carefully, and never appear disengaged. You can observe these images with our non-verbal messages, how we can symbolize our body gesture or posture. You can observe these pictures. So you become aware how we have to use our gesture and posture in our non-verbal communications or messages. Next, dawn. It is also so important for our non-verbal communications. So these are the points basically we have to keep in our mind whatever and whenever we are using non-verbal communication. Rubbing your hand together during a important meetup shouldn't. Leaning back while meeting with a friend or close colleagues. Crossing your arms during interesting conversation. Not making eye contact. Making too much eye contact. Fat-getting. Touching your face too often. These are the basic points which we have to avoid while we are using non-verbal communication. Next, in our day-to-day communications, if I look about the non-verbal communication, then 55% communication is done using body movement, face, arms, etc. and 38% communication is done using voice tone, pauses, etc. But only 7% communication is done using words. So as we can see in this figure, around 93% of our communication is totally non-verbal. So it is so important while we are using our non-verbal communication, please always mind about whatever you are doing while you are using non-verbal communication. Advantages. Actually, there are so many advantages related to non-verbal, but several points mentioned here. First, it helps to lead a compliment. Whenever you are using your spoken words with or without any kinds of words, that means while you are using non-verbal communications for your masses, then it leads a compliment for your expressions or thought or idea, easy presentations, and that means it is easily understandable for our audience while we are using non-verbal communications. It also helps to substitute for our spoken words or our actions. Next, reducing wastage of time. It also helps to reduce of wastage of time, because if our spoken words didn't make understand our audience, our thought or any idea, then our gesture and posture lead a very important role ki what I would like to express. So it is so important, and it is a most appropriate terms which comes under the non-verbal communications. Next, disadvantages. Actually, most of time it's a vague and imprecise. That means ki most of time it's not a massable. Whatever has a meaning, we would like to express in clear way. Continuous. Most of time it's not possible to make understand our audience in continuous while using non-verbal communication. Most of time it is inappropriate, because most of time it leads to multi-channels meanings. Cultural bond. That means ki most of culture having own sign or indications, but while using our non-verbal communications, then it may be our gesture and posture leads to another meanings for a different cultures, peoples, and it is not possible for the long conversations. Written. That means whatever we would like to express by the help of written words. Okay, So if I talk about the written communications, then written communication leads a permanent record, while whatever we would like to express our thought and idea, that leads as a record of our messages. Easy to circulations, we can circulate our messages with the help of written words. Suitable for this statistical data, whatever messages we would like to convey to our audience, all are suitable, as well as it is also suitable for statistical data whatever we are collecting. Disadvantages, that means how it is not appropriate for that. So these are the basic point which comes under it. First is time consuming. Most of time while we are preparing written communications messages, then it leads a time consuming, not flexible. Most of time whatever we have done or written, we can't have, most of time we can't have modified, so not flexible, no scope for clarifications. Most of time as there, it leads not a most appropriate details for our audience while we are using these kinds of platform, because there are only we can use several example, not much. Probability of wrong interpretations, most of times it leads a very wrong in meanings whatever we are using. It may be whatever words is mentioned there, if any mistake is taken place, then it's totally gives wrong interpretations. Visual communication, that means whatever we are as we can observe, we can make understand our audience with the help of diagram, pictures, chart, and any kinds of symbolic expressions, pictures, board, symbolic board, signboard. So all are comes under the visual communications. So these are the basic communications platform which are generally we have to use in our daily lives. Now you can observe these pictures very carefully, which are best examples of visual communication. I hope with the help of this signboard you can easily understand what these indications is related to, which kinds of informations. So these are really very useful for visual communication. Next, most appropriate and most important part of communication, which is communication process or communication cycle. Communication cycle, that means the process by which a message is sent by one individual and it passes through chain of recipient. The timing and effectiveness of communication cycle is based on how long it takes for feedback to receive by the initial sender. So it is so important for communication. Now, which kinds of elements takes place in communication cycle, you can see here. First, source, that means the originator, that means a speaker. Next, message encoding, that means how they are interpreting their message, how they are expressing their thought and idea. Next, channel, that means medium of channel, which kinds of medium they choose. Message decoding, that means how they decode the message by the receiver. So these are the basic elements comes under the communication cycle, and most important element of communication cycle is feedback, because without feedback we can't say that communication is done. So feedback is a so important factor for communication cycle and communications process. Now one by one we try to understand this element. Sender, that means the person or entity originating the communication messages. Message, that means information. Encoding, how they are as a choose to bring the messages. Channel, that means the medium. Receiver, the person or entity who message is sent. Decoding, how receiver interpret the messages and understand. And feedback, that means ki whatever messages is reply by the receiver. So these are the basic elements taken place by the communication cycle. Now next with the help of a video session, we try to understand communication in our daily approaches. So let's enjoy that video session and try to aware how communication is important and how we can deal with the communication process. So let's enjoy this video and watch very carefully. Before going through the video, one most important factor we have to keep in mind. Keep in mind about barriers to communications. Which kinds of barriers really leads to effective communication? So we have to aware about it. So now, with the help of these video sessions, please be aware how and which kinds of barrier leads to very effectiveness and distortions in our communication.
Welcome to NPTEL's course on communication skills. In the first introductory module and the very first lecture, we looked at the introductory aspects of communication skills. Welcome to NPTEL's course on communication skills. In the first introductory module and the very first lecture, we looked at the introductory aspects of communication skills. We looked at the need for communication. More specifically, we looked at the need for effective communication. I discussed about the modalities of communication and then how you can make your communication very effective. I also hinted at the fact that there are some barriers which will actually prevent you to make your communication very effective. In this module, module number 2, lecture number 1, we'll focus on the barriers to communication. And before I start talking to you about the barriers to communication, once again let's recall why communication skills are very important. I would like to recall why it is very important from a famous statement made by one of the shrewdest investors of the world, that is Warren Buffett. He says, if you improve your communication skills, I guarantee you that you will earn 50% more money over your lifetime. What he says is that communication skills will fetch you 50% of your earnings. That's double what you can earn just by enhancing your communications. So I talked about more significance of communication as how it is more related even in your personal and professional life. But if you even keep this view in mind, that overall it's going to enhance your productivity, prosperity, so it's a good way to think about enhancing your communication skills. Look at another statement from Emerson, which focuses on another aspect of communication, a very significant aspect of communication. The quote from Emerson is this. He says, thought is the blossom, language the bud, action the fruit behind it. Now I would like to read action here as communication, because communication means action, reaction, interaction as well as transaction. So all actions put together, we call it as communication. So if you apply what Emerson says, he says thought is the blossom. Okay, so it looks like a flower. Language the bud, action the fruit behind it. So if it blossoms well, you get the fruit out of it. So if the thought is clear, so then the communication is effective. But in between, as I said, there is this process of action, reaction, and then there is interaction and transaction. Unlike what Emerson says, communication process is not that easy, and it is not as natural as a leaf to a tree. It will not be that spontaneously happening. The flow will not be that easy. Why? Because there will be some kind of barriers, and that is the focus of this lecture. In this module, and particularly in this lecture, you will learn about barriers to communication. What are barriers? How do we define barriers? And what kind of barriers we need to keep in mind to make our communication effective? Basically, we are going to focus on 3 kinds of barriers. The first kind, which are arising from sender and or receiver's personality. The first kind is related to personality barriers, and then the second is also related to that, but more in terms of transactions, interpersonal transactions, barriers which come in between interpersonal transactions, and the third is related to organizational network. Probably the third one we will be looking at it in the next lecture of this module, but overall I am just trying to tell you these are the major barriers. At the end of it, and even in between, when I talk about the barriers, I will also try to talk about overcoming the barriers to communication. How can you overcome the barriers? Now first, what are barriers? How do we define barriers? Now barriers are like something that physically blocks you, things which are obstacles to effective communication in a intellectual sense, things which are causing disturbance, which are obstacles to effective communication, anything that impedes free flow of ideas. What is preventing your spontaneous overflow or your ability to express and convey your ideas easily? What is standing in between? Why can't somebody understand whatever you say as what you thought of? Why can't you mean exactly what you say? And why can't the receiver get exactly what you try to mean in your communication? Why the message is always distorted, or most of the times it's not communicated effectively? No, barriers are in between. They impede, they serve as obstacles. Something that prevents active listening and careful response. Look at this carefully. Something that prevents active listening. In the lectures which are going to come, there is a very important lecture on listening skills, an entire module is there on that. So the focus is on active listening. Listening is not, as many of you think, is a passive skill, it's an active skill. What is preventing you to listen actively, pay complete attention, concentrate on what is being told to you, trying to receive the message 100%, something is preventing, and it's also preventing you to give a very careful response, very thoughtful response, responding to the sender in such a manner that the sender understands that the communication message is being given to you accurately, and you are able to receive it and you are able to respond it favorably. But something is preventing, and that something is what we call as barrier, and we are going to look at more examples of that. Now these barriers act as physical, sometimes there are physical barriers blocking communication, mental barriers, emotional barriers, feelings which act as barriers, psychological blocks, mental blocks, psychological thinking, psychological aspects which actually cause barriers. What do? They result in failure of communication and or cause miscommunication. In the next lecture that follows it, we will be looking at more examples on miscommunication. Right now we will focus on the barriers and how it can cause failure in communication. Once again, let me recall the communication process expanded model which we discussed in the first lecture. Look at this. The simple diagrammatic manner, if you look at it, there are two persons, person A and person B, but we call person A as the sender because he is sending the message through the channel, and person B is the one who is receiving the message through the channel. So he is sending it and he is receiving it. Now, if the communication circuit is likely to take place without any problem, then he will be stimulated to give some message. He may encode, decode, and then he sends that through a channel, and then this person decodes, understands, and then encodes again, and then gives the feedback. Now this circular thing should happen spontaneously without any problem, but in between there are barriers. We are going to focus on these barriers because these barriers are not actually allowing whatever this person is sending to the other person who is receiving it to receive it in the most appropriate manner possible. Sometimes channel is distorting, sometimes problem is there in encoding decoding method, sometimes there is a lack of common frame of reference, sometimes there are language barriers, emotional barriers, psychological barriers. Let us look at those barriers. Now generally, just for the sake of understanding, we can look at the barriers coming under three categories, three groups. The first one can be categorized under those barriers which are arising actually from sender and receiver's personality. So the barriers which are actually arising from sender and or receiver's personalities, mostly it is psychological, personality related one, perception oriented ones. Now the other one is interpersonal transactions. When two people come together, apart from the psychological aspect, or there are other aspects. Yes, there are cultural aspects, for example, language problems, for example. So in interpersonal transactions, what are the barriers? And thirdly, the major barrier in communication today is taking place in organizational network. Everything is getting organized, and today we have lots of corporates, business networks, organizations. So here again, lots of barriers are happening. So let's try to understand these three categories with examples and illustrations. Look at the aspect of encoding, decoding in terms of sender, receiver, sending, receiving communication message. Usually what happens, the person encodes a message in a particular language or using non-verbal communication, spoken form or written aspect of communication, and then sends it to the receiver, and the receiver is able to decode it easily. But more often this encoding decoding is not happening that easily, unless and otherwise if they are able to share a common code. This encoding decoding cannot happen that smoothly, that easily. So sharing of a common code, language, or a common frame of reference. In IIT parlance, for example, box can mean not geometry box but computer center actually. So that is the common frame of reference, so where people know by usage that certain thing has to be symbolically referred to or figuratively referred to in such a manner, and one should not take the dictionary or denotative meaning as such. Now look at a simple example. Suppose there is this kind of message sent as an SMS from one mobile phone to another mobile phone. The message is this: short circuit at office. Short circuit at office. Please send an electrician. Now, there could be so many contexts, so many frames of references. A simple one like the manager telling one of his subordinates that there is a short circuit. So when you come back, you send an electrician, find somebody on the way and send the person for repair. Absolutely clear. But it need not be electrician as such. Short circuit need not actually refer to the electrical short circuit, especially if the context will change. If it happens to be spy stories, for example, if James Bond is sending this message to his boss M or to another spy, and this is the message, and if this is sent, so short circuit at office could mean as well my partner is kidnapped. It could also mean my assistant is killed. Send someone for my help. So you send a substitute, you send another assistant, which means send an electrician who will come and fix the job. So depending on the frame of reference, the meaning changes. The person who knows the common frame of reference will be able to encode, decode smoothly, and the barrier will not happen. But if this common code is missing, language there is problem, and then common frame of reference is absent, so then it will not be possible for you to encode and decode properly. Look at another interesting example that happened between sender and receiver. This example is to illustrate to you that even when the language is common, misunderstandings can happen, miscommunication can take place. How? When the sender is not clear about her objective, or inappropriate use of language, or the sender uses the language not in the most appropriate manner possible, leaving some sense of ambiguity. For example, I'm just going to narrate to you the real incident of an American tourist who missed a flight just because of a communication gap. Now let's look at this. The housewife happens to go somewhere. She's a tourist, and then she has come back, maybe traveled quite a lot, and then she's wearing very gaudy dress, costly necklace, earrings, bracelets, and all that. So very nicely decorated also, and she has a lot of baggage along with her. And suddenly the customs officer stops her, the security stops her, and then he goes for a thorough checkup. So he calls for a female help, and then they even take her personally. They check her belongings, they frisk her thoroughly. They kept on doing this for more than an hour. At the end of it, they said that, okay, fine, ma'am, you can go. And then she was wild. She got angry because they delayed her. She missed her connecting flight. Okay, because they caused a lot of delay in checking her belongings, so she had to miss her connecting flight. Then she got wild, and then she asked the person who checked her, she asked that, officer, what is this? Is it just fun? Is it your way of harassing some people who fly randomly, and then you just wanted to have some fun? Or is it your routine checkup, and then I was victimized, I lost my connecting flight? So what do you say for this? And then the officer replied, ma'am, it's not like that. Then why? Ma'am, it's about your occupation. So what? So I asked you about your occupation, and then you said you are a nun. What did I say? Actually, what the housewife said was this: when he asked for her occupation, she didn't want to tell him that she happened to be a housewife, so she simply said nun. Now the confusion here is, the housewife said that her occupation is nun, N-O-N-E, meaning that no occupation, no specific occupation. She didn't want to say housewife. But the officer understood her as a nun. Now his confusion is, if she is a nun, N-U-N, and if she is a sister. Okay. Now if she is not looking like this, and she is looking like somebody who is more interested in worldly pursuits, materialistic life, and he couldn't believe that. Was she telling a lie? So he was not sure. So it's just between this confusion that happened, same pronunciation, different spelling, different meaning, and it caused the lady to miss her flight and caused lot of misunderstanding between both the sender and the receiver. Now if you look at this case, both of them happen to be Americans. Both of them happened to be the native speakers of English. There was absolutely no problem in terms of speaking the language. There is no problem in terms of pronouncing the language correctly. But the problem happened because the sender didn't bother to tell the other person clearly what she meant when she said none. And also the receiver took it for granted. When she said none, he took it for granted that that is her occupation. And for a while he did not think that none could also mean nothing. He didn't think that way. He didn't clarify, she didn't explain, she didn't elaborate more. She didn't had a small doubt as why he was doing this continuously. He also didn't seek clarification. Now if both had come down and then tried to use a better word or try to seek clarification, this could have been sorted out. But this is an illustration to tell you that in spite the fact that you speak the language correctly, you pronounce the language correctly, then also communication blunders, communication mistakes can happen like this. That is because the sender or the receiver, they are not having a common frame of reference. They are not willing to use the language in a very appropriate manner. Look at some more examples, it will become easier. I am going to give you another example where the receiver is unable to understand and interpret the message properly. This is an interesting example from a classroom situation where the teacher happens to give a message and then one of the students could not get the message correctly. So let's see how it happened. This teacher, thinking that he will be able to give the message very clearly, he wanted to demonstrate that. Instead of going and giving a lecture as such, he wanted to demonstrate it. So what did he do and what was the message? The message was this: he wanted to tell the students that drinking arak, drinking liquor, okay, or taking drinks, okay, any kind of alcoholic drinks, he wanted the students to know that will be harmful to their health, it can even kill them. In order to illustrate this, what did he do? He went to the class with a bottle of arak, and even there it was written as arak, the crude form of liquor. And the smell itself was so pungent that in the entire class they could smell it as soon as he took the bottle. And he had another small transparent container in which he had just picked up some earthworms from the garden on his way, and the earthworms were alive, kicking, wriggling, moving around. So he just showed them those two bottles. He didn't tell what he was going to tell them, but he wanted them to take the message. So now the teacher is the sender. He is going to give a message. The message is drinking liquor in any form is going to harm you. So what did he do? He took the bottle and then he showed it to the students. He asked the students, do you see what is there in this bottle? So they said, yes sir, we can see. What is it? They said, sir, arak, arak. Okay, how do you know? Sir, it's written there and as well as we could smell it. So it's very bad, it's smelling so bad. Okay, now what do you see in this small container? So they said, sir, we could see earthworms. So are they alive or dead? They are alive, sir, they are fully alive. So we could see them moving. Okay, now see what happens. He started picking one earthworm after another. He picked one, dropped it in the bottle. Now he dropped it slowly, but then as soon as the earthworm touched the arak, so it started wriggling very fast. It moved here and there, but then after some time it could not move. It became flat and slowly it settled down. It died. He took another one and then he dropped it. So the students were watching with enthusiasm, interest. Some were very sympathetic and they said, oh, they are dying. So he dropped one after another until all the earthworms were dead. Now he showed the bottle. He asked them, now you can you see this? They said, yes sir. Have you got the message? Yes sir, we got the message. Have you understood it clearly? They said, yes sir, we have understood the message very clearly. Now, what is the message? Can somebody tell this? And then one guy from the last bench was raising his hand, and then he said that, sir, I can tell you the message very clearly. He said, yes, please go ahead, stand up and tell the message. He said, sir, you brought arak and then you put these earthworms there, so they died. So the message is this, that if you drink arak, if you take liquor, it will kill all the worms in your stomach. So sir, he said, we should be drinking arak every time we take food. We should be drinking some kind of liquor every time we have some trouble in stomach, so that it will go and kill all the worms in the stomach. Now the teacher was totally bewildered. So the message he wanted to give was, he wanted to tell the student, look, if you take arak, it will kill your stomach itself. It will kill your digestive system and it will eventually kill you. So in order to show that, he wanted to tell that how sensitive your stomach is, just like the earthworms. If it can kill the earthworms, it will kill your intestines also. So take care. So avoid taking this. But he took the contradictory.
Sure. Thanks for watching this video. I saw with the help of this session of this video, whatever different types of barriers for the communications we are aware, but along with these kinds of barriers, the most appropriate barrier in communications are linguistic, cultural, physical and organizational and interpersonal barriers, which leads to distortions between communication process. So now one by one we try to understand in a short way. Physical barrier, that means it may be environmental natural conditions that act as a barrier in communication, in sending messages from sender to receiver. Not being able to see, gesture, posture and general body language can make communications less effective. For example, text messages are often less effective than face-to-face communication. So now, if I talk about the linguistic barrier, then the inability to communicate using language is known as language barrier to communication. Language barriers are the most common communications barrier which cause misunderstandings and misinterpretations between people. Example, professional jargons and religious colloquialisms can make communication difficult. That means कि most of time ऐसे whatever happen कि whatever spoken words are using while we are using communications, then most of different languages having the own vocabs. So most of time it are not appropriate for understanding of the language. So these kinds of has a lack of understanding of language leads linguistic barriers. Next, interpersonal barriers. That means the barriers to interpersonal communications occurs when the sender's message is received differently from how it was intended. That means it's a totally different whatever the originating. So in this way, I can say our sender or receiver, that means between the sender or receiver having the different sense of as a thought and idea expressions, whatever intention to conversations of sender, it may be different for the receiver. So in these conditions it leads to interpersonal barriers. Next, organizational barriers. Most of time it is seen that most of organizations having own code of conduct for the communications, and most of has appropriate words and appropriate suitables of the sentences have to use for their colleagues as well as their employees. So most of time it happens कि different regions employees while they are as under the organizations, then if they don't use their code of conduct languages, then in this way they they getting part of organizational barrier. And next one and most appropriate is cultural barrier, because cultural barriers already related to such kinds of places where peoples belongs. That means different places, people's different cultures and traditions, what they are following. Cultural barriers is when people of different cultures are unable to understand each other's customs, resulting in inconveniences and difficulties. People sometimes make stereotypical assumptions about others based on their culture's background. This leads to difference in opinion and can be major barriers to effective communication. That means it totally leads to misunderstanding while others listeners or between the sender or receivers, they are talking like different customs and traditions words, then these barriers comes place, that means takes place. Although there are certain barriers to effective communications, we can always overcome these barriers by most of the different kinds of as a listed whatever we have to use. So if we really would like to overcome these kinds of barrier, there are so many as a list available here. We can as a observe one by one and try to implement for avoiding avoiding any kinds of barriers. So these are the ways we can use in our communications process for avoiding barriers. First of all, use simple language. Do not form assumptions on cultures, religions or geography. Try to communicate in person as much as possible. Use visuals. Make help of translator to overcome differences in languages. Be respectful of others' opinion. That means whatever possibility and whatever reducing factor which helps to reduce our barriers in communication, we have to use. So with the help of this session, in our concluding part, I would like to inform you all that communication always part of human beings in every platformer. But if we have an idea how to communicate, then it becomes so impressive for our listener कि how we are behaving, how we are expressing our thought and idea. So that's why I would like to aware you all to be respectful, be aware कि whatever you are talking and how you have to deal with this situation and which kinds of words and sentences you have to use while you are arguing and conversationing with anyone. So always keep in your mind कि how I can make our communication so effective and which kinds of factors that we have to avoid for better communication process. So these are the basic factors and basic information which we have to always keep in our mind while we are communicating anyone. Either you are using this for personally or any professionally, so all where you can use your communication in good way and good manners. So it's so important to always be aware communications factors, communication cycle, as well as utilizations of communications platform and which platforms are suitable for your conversation, thought and idea. Then if you have a tendency to choose these kinds of expectations, then you really can make your communication so better and so good. So today's for these sessions, I can only would like to say keep Always be aware about your communications process. And today's for this session, that's all. Thank you.